Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is your brother, asarimhotep, with the Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. And we are here again today. Today is July the 6th, Monday. It is 10 a.m. on the East Coast and 3 p.m. in London. And the London time is significant because of our guest who is on the program today. We're having a conversation overseas, and we are blessed and honored to have him. We're going to be having a conversation with our good brother Hermel Hermstein, who is the author of the Black Sumer series. And so it's a work in 3 volumes. Black Sumer, Volume 1, the linguistic evidence. Black Sumer, Volume 2, the physical evidence, which itself is broken up into 2 books, Part 1 and Part 2. And then the 3rd volume, which is set to be released in the near future. And so I had the opportunity to kind of witness to a small degree his growth and development in terms of historical comparative linguistic analysis. And, I was live on the Oriental Institute listserv where they was having this dialogue about Black Sumer, just Sumerian, the language itself. And so this was before, he actually published the books, and he was just throwing the ideas out there and seeing, how it would stand up to scrutiny amongst other linguists. And so I had already been familiar with some arguments regarding Sumerian at this time based on some older works. And, but his was definitely very, very refreshing. And so, it is an honor to finally get to meet him at this moment. And so before I do, I like to thank first and foremost all of you who are listening live to this program, and those, of course, who can't catch us live but who are listening to the archives. I'd like to say big ups and respects to you all, and thank you all who have decided to make yourself known in the chat room. So big ups to Infinite Minds, Jeremy Kadar, Don Williams, Dion Florence, Ernest Godfrey, Omar Reed, Kofi Kessie Akut, A. Unk Kim, Ichwi Tinin, Crystal Hadnot, Brother Sanjeti Unk Ra, and everyone else who is viewing live but who have not themselves made themselves known in the chat. Peace to Simeon, the Atheist Killer, that's a unique name, RC Moabite, peace and blessings to you all. And so as more trickles in, I'll make sure I give, you all a shout out as time progresses. So this is normally, earlier than we would normally do our shows. That's again because of the time difference uh, for between our guest and where they reside, and us over here in the States. So I know it's 7 a.m. for those of you in California. So I don't expect to see too many people from Cali up listening to this show live. But peace, Sister Tamika. Um, thank you for joining us. As always, and we will get started. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone to Brother Hermel Hermstein. How are you this afternoon where you are?
I'm fine. I'm doing quite well.
All right. Thank you.
And hope
Thank
you are
you
too.
again for, yes. Thank you again for, coming on the program and dialoguing with me and my audience. So peace to, who is this? In Lugani, y'all, live from London. So you have some London people checking you out and wanting to hear about this very rich and interesting topic. And so you are the author of Black Sumer, which makes the essential arguments that these, uh, if not primarily or throughout its duration, that the Sumerian people were Black African people. And before we, get into the nature of your books and the research you were doing in those texts, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, any education, and then more so, how did you get interested in this subject? What was that path to get to Black Sumer?
Yeah. Um, right at the very beginning, I met Fari Sapir and Robin Walker in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that day clearly. It was at an event where Jacob Carovers was the main speaker, and it was held by Karnak House. Karnak House is like the main Afrocentric publishing house in the UK. This was back in the 90s.
Mm.
And so I went to West London, and at the end of the event, the people who were near where we were sitting, like the young people, the people in their early 20s, we got together and about 8 of us went for a drink afterwards in a nearby cafe. And we sat there. There was me, there was Fari Sapir, there was Robin Walker, and there was about 4 or 5 other people there. And so as we broke bread, um, Robin talked about how he had this ambition to write a book on Mesopotamia that did the same thing for Mesopotamia that African origin of civilization did for Egypt.
Mm.
In other words, outlining the case for a Black Egypt with all the multidisciplinary evidence. He wanted to do the same thing for Mesopotamia. But as the conversation was going on, he said that you two, pointing to me and Fari, seemed to be even more interested in Mesopotamia than he was, and he had his own book that he was working on, which was different from that at the time. So essentially, he said that, why don't you two do that book, and I'll continue developing the book that I'm developing, which culminated eventually in When We Ruled. There was one book he published first, and then he did When We Ruled. And in theory, we took up the offer. But after that, we went our separate ways, and that was that. I didn't really do any. I did research, but I was not doing work on any book. Then something happened. Sometimes, if you're a bit negligent about your affairs, something will happen that makes you have to do that thing that you had neglected doing all along. And that's what happened. In 2000, I answered an advert for a Black Studies course. Robin Walker used to do Black Studies courses. I think he still does. And every year he would have maybe 2-3 classes or something like that. People would come and I think Fari Sapir was trying to start the same thing with Robin's assistance. So when I turned up to the day, who do I see? I see Fari Sapir, I see Robin Walker, and there were 2 other people there as well. And the 2 other people were Anum Bantu and Gert Muller. And that's what became Pomegranate Publishing. Now, the actual idea for the class was a flop because only 3 people turned up. So that didn't go anywhere. But the things that we were then taught, not in an official setting, but we met up for drinks like once every 4 weeks. And basically what Fari was doing is his lessons, in quotes, were really him turning up with one of his notebooks, about 200-300 pages of handwritten notes. And he would start to read selected passages and explain what it was about. And then you got a picture building up of basically Black ancient history from that and from different disciplines. Then when we had finished that, he then went on to specialist areas. And the specialist areas were linguistics and psychology. I wanted to do the linguistics. Gert Muller and Bantu wanted to do the psychology. And then that's how we finally split ways. So I would meet up with Fari, would do the linguistics. This was after the year 2000. And the other 2 were doing psychology. And that's how the whole thing started. And then in 2003, he recontacted me and said, would you like to do some more linguistics? I said, yeah. And then we continued from there. And then that's how I wrote first a paper length, and then that paper was developed into Black Sumer Volume 1. In terms of education, I don't have anything outside of high school, but I did do a course in a module, should I say, in the Sumerian language with Birkbeck College, which is attached to London University. It was essentially an evening class. I don't even think I bring it up in the book, but I have that familiarity with the Sumerian language from that course.
Indeed, indeed. And before we go further, I want to, since you brought up his name, to remind everyone that we will be interviewing Brother Robin Walker, the author, the historian of When We Ruled, who he had mentioned in the answering of that question. So, and I'm going to try to get Brother Fari Sapir on as well. So I go back digitally, at least, with Brother Fari and Brother Robin Walker to the early 2000s. And so it will be a very interesting and dynamic conversation. So, just a reminder, it's going to be on next Tuesday, the 14th of July. It will be 3 p.m. London time, and again 10 a.m. East Coast time here in the United States. So put that in your calendars. Make sure that you set your or hit the reminder and subscribe to the channel if you have not, so that you can get the notifications, when these interviews, are scheduled and come about. So, so now that by fate of, as we say, the ancestors or the universe kind of putting these people, in your path and encouraging you to study linguistics, like, how did that process go? So, like for me, linguistics happened in basically the same way, because my training primarily was in software development, computer science, and taking modules and doing self-study in the languages, and kind of some mentorships with certain linguists has kind of led me into studying. So how was that process for you, learning the linguistics, and why was the linguistics important for you when trying to answer this question regarding Mesopotamia?
Yeah. The linguistics that I started doing with Fari back in at the end of 2000
Mm-hmm.
was very basic,
Mm-hmm.
but I got the idea that there's something here. This wasn't just a theory. There was actual practical results from it. It's when I saw the comparisons of English and German that I realized that, okay, so this isn't speculative. There are actual patterns here, and those patterns, that they tell a story. It can't just be chance. And then when he contacted me in 2003, um, what what had happened with him is he said he was in SOAS, London University, and he was trying to test the idea that he was essentially trying to see whether the Niger Congo actually existed, because this question had been asked by I was about to say Thabo Mbeki. That's certainly not Thabo Mbeki. Obenga, Dr. Obenga,
Mm-hmm.
had questioned the existence of Niger Congo, and he had said that essentially most of the Black African languages were equidistant, let us say, in their relationship. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what the conclusion he came to was that there was a Niger Congo. And I remember us discussing this at the time, and he said, "This is why I think." And he showed me the evidence, and he had started comparing Wolof with Proto-Bantu. And I think the reason why he started with Wolof, he didn't say this at the time, this is just me thinking, was probably because of the influence of Professor Diop, the late,
Mm-hmm.
great, because he did Wolof in ancient Egyptian. So of the Niger Congo languages, I think Wolof stood out, and he had come across a dictionary. So he compared the two. And he had been expecting to find that there wouldn't be as much as he found. So he found some very strong similarities that implied that even though Wolof was not a Bantu language, but that it was probably the next stage on. So if Bantu languages were cousins, Wolof was probably a second cousin. Um, and then the next thing he did is he compared with non-Niger Congo languages. And so he came to the conclusion that these ones must be further off if there's any relationship at all. And then he compared Proto-Bantu with Sumerian, and then his conclusion was Sumerian, therefore is a Niger Congo language.
Mm-hmm.
So that was essentially the linguistics lessons that I was getting. But there wasn't much in terms of the comparison of Proto-Bantu and Sumerian. I think he had something like 50 to 60 words.
Hmm.
And I said, I think we need more than that. And
Hmm.
so I did a lot of searching, and I found, in the end, I found something like between 115 and 125, somewhere there in that region. And that became the basis for Black Sumer, the African Origins of Civilization, or should I say Black Sumer Volume 1. And that's how that book was born. Robin Walker also made an interesting contribution, because I was trying to write in very technical terms. And one of the things Robin said is that you should actually try to, if you really know your stuff, you should be able to simplify it.
Hmm.
Whereas I was thinking, if you want to show that you know, particularly when you don't have an education, you feel almost like you're undressed standing in the arena, compared to people like Diop, compared to people like Obenga, doctors, and you're standing there and you've only got a high school education, and you may feel the need to use these technical terms as your clothes. His advice is, you need to be able to simplify this. If you really understand it, you'll be able to simplify it. And that had a big impact on me, because I thought, well, what's more important, looking good or getting the job done and getting people to understand what you're saying? And so I went with that.
Indeed. And one of the things I can say about the text is, I think that you do a real good job in the introduction, in terms of explaining, for example, the comparative method and certain issues that you would look for when, or certain variables and challenges and tests that you would look for when you're trying to make arguments for a possible relationship between two or more languages. And I think that it was written in a way that, for someone who doesn't have a background in linguistics, they could follow along very easily, and be able to pick up on the methodology and the underlying issues that any researcher would be concerned with, in terms of this particular field of research. Now, in When We Ruled, Brother Fari has a chapter in that text. He kind of ends the text with a discussion on Sumerian and Proto-Bantu. So I know he's not here, but is that part of that, his initial, research that you were talking about, that,
Yeah,
just kind of ended up in the end of that book?
yeah. Like I said, he came up with about 50 to 60 words. And he did Proto-Bantu and Sumerian, but he did Proto-Bantu and some of the individual West African languages as well. He did Yoruba, he did Igbo,
Mm-hmm.
and some other languages. I went and looked at that, and I kind of essentially stood on his shoulders to
Hmm.
extend the lists. I think I ended up doing Proto-Bantu in Yoruba. I ended up coming up with something like 120.
Hmm.
Proto-Bantu and Wolof, maybe something like 80. Proto-Bantu and Fula, I came
Hmm.
up with, I extended whatever list he had, I extended it a bit. I think
Hmm.
that was the most extensive list he had, the Proto-Bantu and Fula.
Hmm.
And I revisited the Proto-Bantu and Akan of Stuart, but I was only looking at Akan. I
Hmm.
wasn't looking at the whole Proto-Bantu Potu Akanic.
Hmm.
I just stuck to the Akan, and yeah. So yeah, his initial research ended up in When We Ruled as the concluding chapter.
Indeed, indeed. And
And then
so,
my stuff is taken up from there.
yeah, I actually extended some of his um, from that chapter. Like, hold on one sec. When I put together this book, uh, Aluja Volume 2, see how thick it is, Chiana into Religion and Philosophy. When I'm dealing with the Sumerian, like I took his table, like he has this one table that he initiated, and I did the ancient Egyptian with it, and you can still see the patterns between the Sumerian, Proto-Bantu, and the other West African languages. You can see the Egyptians correspond with it as well. And I know we have differing views on the classification schemas of the African languages, but it's primarily because of that. Uh, when you do these, which Alon Anselin, um, may he rest in peace, he would call, trans phylic uh, correspondences. So if you ever familiar with, he mainly writes in French, but he has the journal out in the Caribbean, and kind of the lay journal as well, the public one, which is iMedjot. Um, you'll see a lot of his, comparisons. He still sticks to the Greenbergian, Nilo-Saharan, Niger Congo, uh, Khoisan, and Afro-Asiatic, but he always shows these that you'll find the cognates, you know, cross trans or trans phyla, so to speak. And I'm a bit more strict when when it comes to the arguments of relationships. And so again, I come from a more science background, so you have to you can't just assume just because someone says that this is the case that it is in fact the case. Like when I was looking for those initial works that demonstrated that Niger Congo, Nilo-Saharan, Khoisan, et cetera, actually exist using the comparative method, I could not find it. And I would email these linguists and say, hey, where can I find that work that demonstrates that? And they can never answer. They always say it's assumed. So I was like, but I know that I mentioned earlier the Oriental Institute listserv, where you and Fari were kind of hashing out, and presenting some of your preliminary arguments to the linguistic community. Can you tell, if you can recall, back then, the kinds of responses and challenges to the idea that Sumerian could possibly be related to a quote unquote Niger Congo language, especially one, Proto-Bantu?
Yeah. There was a very discouraging response. The very idea that there might be a relationship was not received well by people. I mean, the reason why I went on there in the first place, because I wouldn't have wasted my time were it not for this reason.
Hmm.
Around about 2002 or 2003, somewhere around there, I must have come across a historical archive of that same, website or web space, where
Hmm.
there was a discussion about Proto-Bantu and Sumerian. But the discussion was not that they were genetically related, but that the substrate language, I think that's what it's called, of Sumerian, that it had evidence of a substrate language, a language that was in Mesopotamia before Sumerian, and that language was Proto-Bantu.
Hmm.
And the person who was coming up with this idea gave his reasons for why he thought this. And I think some of it involved the Sumerian language of women, in quotes, called Emesal. It's a dialect. There's two main dialects in Sumerian, Emenir and Emesal. And he said that when you look at the Emesal versions, it reminds him of certain things in Proto-Bantu, and he thinks that this was a substrate language. And that was why I thought, okay, this is a place where, and there was no animosity shown to the person who was bringing this up. But what I failed to realize is it's one thing to say that there were people like this in the area before, and to actually say the Sumerians were those people. Those are two different things. It's a bit like arguing that there were black people in Egypt before the ancient Egyptians, and that the ancient Egyptians came there and there was a few of them left and to some degree intermixed with them, and saying the ancient Egyptians were black. Those are two different things, and they'll get two different receptions. And that's essentially what happened. Nobody could really successfully argue against what we said. It was more a case of we're not going to accept this. They tried to come with counter arguments, but none of them were. In the end, they had to ban us because the counter arguments were not working, and it was clear that their counter arguments were not working.
It's interesting because your story reminds me of I think I mentioned to you in our previous conversation, Brother Jean-Claude Mboli, a French linguist who wrote a text, The Origin of African Languages. And, you know, when he basically did the same thing. And so when he, for example, the motivation behind his essential work was to see if his native language, well, he has kind of two native languages, which is Sango and Zande. His one, you know, I forget if it's the mother or the father, which one speaks which, but one is a native Sango speaker and one is a native Zande. And he just grew up speaking, you know, both of his parents' languages. So, you know, after reading the works of Diop and reading the works of Obinga, you know, Diop dealing with Wolof, his native language, and Obinga dealing with Mbochi, his native language. If his language was related to ancient Egyptian. And so, you know, he took a number of courses formally because he's actually, his first training is in engineering and electrical engineering. And so it took him, you know, so of course he deviated and, you know, he didn't go back to school like to get a degree in linguistics, but he did, you know, train and then from there continue in his autodidactic works. And he was able to demonstrate to his satisfaction the relationship between Sango and Zande and ancient Egyptian, which again would give credence to the arguments made by Diop and Obinga, and then of course others like Babacar Sal and Abubakar Musalam, Omen Digi, etc. These other linguists who also studied their languages in relationship to ancient Egyptian. That something else is going on here, that the way that these languages are classified, they cannot be accurate because we would not be able to see this type of relationship using the comparative method. Now, I understand the motivation behind the mass comparative method because there's a belief that, you know, after like 8,000 years, the effectiveness of the comparative method breaks down. So it's kind of like in physics when you're talking about, you know, Einstein's general relativity. Well, general relativity explains everything on the macro, but when it comes down to quantum mechanics, it breaks down at quantum mechanics. So this is kind of the motivation behind the search for a grand unified field theory that kind of unites, you know, the relativity, quantum gravity, as well as quantum mechanics. And so in that same vein, in a similar in an analogous vein, you know, that the if you're using the standard historical comparative method and you can establish a relationship, then the idea of the phyla is not an explanatory model that accurately reflects the relationship between, for example, a in Bochi, which is a Bantu language, and Sango and Zande, um, which is like Ubongian or something to that nature in the whole Niger Congo area, whatnot. And uh and so with the ancient Egyptian, like it's just not supposed to be there. And so he went on a number of linguistic sites and forums and started presenting some of his work to try to get some feedback from the linguist.
And
And
how did
so
that work out?
yeah, I got to witness both of your experience,
Hmm.
in that listserv and in Boli's experience. And it's the same, is that, when you present the standard historical comparative method and you're showing these relationships that are non-accidental and reoccurring, that this would be the smoking gun for any linguist around the world to establish, some kind of relationship. They outright reject it, but never respond with critiques of the actual
Yeah.
information that was given. So what the common thing that I saw with y'all's, because this happens to me, so I know I see this pattern with people
Hmm.
who they have in their mind that these relationships or non-relationships exist, and anything outside of this standard label is somehow like pseudoscience. But they can never actually, because if it was pseudoscience, it'd be easy to say, well, you haven't shown any patterns here, da 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 da. These are
Yeah.
loan words, da da da. It would be easy to do that. But
Hmm.
when y'all presented this information in these different forums, that was never the case. They would just a priori dismiss it because of the
Hmm.
idea that Sumerian
Yeah.
could be related to. So they never analyzed the work. They would just give y'all possibilities. Well, that could be chance, in terms of the language. But it can't be chance if you're showing, for example, um, let's do the two consonant paradigm. The in terms of the homographs, I would say.
Yeah.
If there's like some shared homographs in the
Yeah.
language, and then you're seeing that in the potentially related language, and you're seeing the same patterns, like
Hmm.
that means something. Like that's not accidental. You can't say that is a result of chance. And so I was seeing that, and so it let me know, how they react to, because you
Hmm.
can tell really who actually does the work and who doesn't. And so some can
Hmm.
only say certain things, but they themselves have never done the work to even verify if these relationships are actually right and exact, or is this just something they learned in class and they believed it, because an authority told them to. um and so I found that, very interesting, that exchange. And so it was that, seeing, you go through the fire and be able to answer them word for word, that made me pay attention and really, support the work. And and I've even cited it in several of my works, and gone on to do my own comparisons and extensions. Uh, but even still, like you mentioned, someone mentioned that there's a possible substrate of Proto-Bantu in Mesopotamia, for Sumerian. But you're not the first person or that person to suggest that there was a relationship between um, Bantu and Sumerian. So if you can name offhand, if you remember those previous scholars who
Right.
also made those suggestions.
Yeah. Okay. The first, uh, okay, the first actual person who I saw in the flesh
Uh-huh.
who said that was Fari Sapir.
Uh-huh.
Now, the texts that I went to look at where this was being discussed, one was Father Willibald Wanger,
Mm-hmm.
a German father from the 1930s, and he was looking at Zulu and Sumerian. The problem with that approach is um, you would have to show that the Zulu word actually has a long history and that it's not something that came about, um, say, 400 years ago. There is a way of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
If you can find the Proto-Bantu reconstruction and show the Zulu word as a reflex of that, that's one way of proving the ancestry. The other way is to do a direct comparison between Zulu and one of the richer Bantu languages in terms of having Proto-Bantu reflexes,
Mm-hmm.
like Kikongo and Chiluba.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two that Guthrie point out and says that they're particularly rich in those. So you could do this too. Another one, interestingly enough, is Swahili.
Mm-hmm.
Most people wouldn't think so because there's a perception of Swahili as being essentially a mixed language, Arabic and Bantu. But in terms of its basic vocabulary, it is heavily Bantu. So if you did a, say, Zulu and Chiluba or Zulu and Kikongo, all the cognates that you would find classify as ancient, um, as words with an ancient origin. And those words can then be compared to whichever language that you're linking them to, whether it's ancient Egyptian, whether it's Sumerian, or whichever. I can remember this was back in 2003. Fari Sapir showing me a list of ancient Egyptian and Proto-Bantu, but it wasn't a very long list. His interpretation was that whatever the relationship is with the Niger-Congo languages, this has to be a step onwards. In other words, when they're doing the subclassifications and they're doing the family,
Mm-hmm.
this would have to be a more senior, like a third cousin or a fourth cousin. That was his interpretation of it. I never actually did any comparisons myself of Egyptian and Proto-Bantu, but I saw the list that he did. And I think the two of them I remember clearly because they both began with K. One was cut and the other one was frog
Mm-hmm.
with Proto-Bantu.
Indeed. So, you do the first volume that has to deal with the language. So you've done enough to your satisfaction that you've established the non-accidental reoccurring sound meaning correspondences with basic vocabulary of Proto-Bantu and the Sumerian language. So that is enough to begin the process, because you still, of course, would have, and you did some morphological analysis, but the whole paradigm
Mhm.
comparison that had yet to be done. But the vocabulary is always the first step, so that you can establish the sound laws between the two comparative languages. So you go there, you do that analysis, and then you have now this question. Well, first and foremost, the Proto-Bantu speakers are alleged to originate somewhere on the borders of Nigeria and Cameroon,
Yeah.
which is way over there in,
The
West Central
opposite
Africa.
direction.
But
Yeah.
the Sumerians are all the way over there in modern
Mhm.
day Iraq. And so,
Mhm.
is it a question of, did the Proto Sumerians branch split off from there and travel into Africa, or did the Africans travel into Mesopotamia? And then, what does that mean ultimately for the origins of the Sumerians? And then, of course, the so called racial issue, because the Sumerians are always presented as this this non-African group in terms of stereotypical African. So you you come to the conclusion, of course, that these are African people. And if I remember correctly, I think you make the argument that they possibly traveled through Lake Chad, into East Africa, and then kind of hopped over the Red Sea, or possibly through Yemen, on up into Sumeria, or Iraq, modern day Iraq. Um, so that's just simply based on the linguistic evidence. So then you go on a little bit further and you say, well, is there some physical evidence that establishes, this Africanity of the Sumerians? And thus here comes volume two. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what brought that on, and what did you learn as a process, as a result of doing that research, and why did you split it into two separate books?
Yeah. Um, See, the the first volume was supposed to be the physical evidence,
Hmm.
but the way life turns out sometimes, when I got onto the linguistics, I just couldn't put it down, and there was a lot to do. I mean, Niger Congo, you're looking at something like 3,000 languages, or is it 1,500? I think it's 1,500 for Niger Congo and 3,000 for the whole of Africa. So half of Africa's languages are in the Niger Congo family, and 10% of the world's languages are in Niger Congo. So I was busy. There was a lot to do. Doing protobonsu comparisons with this language, that language, and so forth. And so in the end, around 2012 is when I was completing the the linguistic research, and that's I decided to put that out first as the first volume, and I didn't put everything in it. I then had to do what was supposed to be volume one as volume two. That then had to be the next one because it was just sitting around, and that had to come out. And then when I finished that, then I started work on volume three, and I completed it in quotes, but it still needed a lot of work, and I never got back to doing that because life just gets in the way. You still have to earn a living, you still have to engage in economic activity, and that just ended up taking up uh, most of my time. In the near future, I will take a look at that and then put it out. But that one is then uh, an attempt to reconstruct Niger Congo. But to get back to the question you actually asked, volume 2, um, Faris Sapir had done some work on on the skeletons from Mesopotamia. This was back before I was doing any classes with him, and that had been part of the lessons. But I argue that this should be um, in volume 2, and he allowed me to use that information. And then most of it was built around the skeletal reports and what he had taught about the art, because he had divided art into like different categories. He had actually come up with a scheme where you could appreciate art, and using that and the skeletal reports, I was able to basically build a volume around it. And that was volume 2. But then volume 2 was so long, it had to be split into 2 parts, 1 and 2. And there was simply too much. I remember it trying to, because a lot of the initial publishing we were doing at the time was on Kindle. And Kindle just wouldn't accept the whole, because initially I just tried to do it as one and have it like as a 400, 500 page book. Kindle said no. And if I'd known then what I know now, it's things like resolution of the pictures and so forth. You can reduce the resolution, and file size might pass. But at the time, I didn't know that. I'm not particularly computer literate. I'm still, in some ways, a beginner in that sense. So we did it in 2 parts.
And not to interrupt you, but I'm showing just screens of the Kindle version of the part 1 of volume 2. So just showing random pages in it. But I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah, and I'd say in that work, I put my heart and soul into that. I think it's a much better written, from a readability point of view. It's much easier to digest than volume 1, and writing it was just a different experience. There were less complex issues that people had to deal with. Only when it came to the anthropology did it become complex, the bioanthropology. But for everything else, it was pretty easy to explain. You didn't have to, you had to put thought into how you were saying it, but not into making it digestible. Whereas volume 1, the linguistics, you really had to think about how do you simplify this so people can understand.
Indeed. And yeah, people really don't understand the complexities of historical comparative linguistics. And as I argued in Alucha Volume 2, linguistics is not science, in the sense that, in science it's based on repeated experiments and, with different variables, seeing if you get the same results. Because you can't, for example, go back and talk to ancient Sumerians, or ancient Egyptians, or any of the ancient groups, to really get a sense of their language. It's historical comparative linguistics is more so along the lines of logic and mathematics. And it requires a certain way of deductive reasoning and proof formulas and things of that nature, which, for a lot of people, it's a strong learning curve involved. And so I understand trying to simplify this, because that people have a hard time understanding math in general. And so, you have this visual math which is, because you're dealing with, group theory and sets, and stuff to this nature, and equations and abstractions, and laws and all this other kind of stuff. And um, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a layperson conversation. So I understand that completely. Uh, I don't know if I have the part 2 on here. I just had the physical, but yeah, I just wanted to show this real quick to how do I get out of here? Let me reduce. There we go. Um, so yeah, um, so what, like, give us some major evidences that you came across in the volume 2 set that really kind of solidifies the Africanity of the Sumerians. And so, you know, uh, and then also, how would you address the appearance of the Sumerians, as it regards some of the artwork? Like, what should we be looking for? What's some of the deep arguments there?
Yeah. The Sumerian art shows obvious African influence in terms of the faces of the sculptures. There's also things you see when you look at the Sumerian crowns and the
Mm-hmm.
Sumerian hats. There's one hat that's worn by dignitaries or rulers like Gudea, and it recoils woolly hair.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the way that the hair is, the the design of the cap. And first, what we do is we show you headgear with hair depicted on it, where the hair is wavy or curly.
Mm-hmm.
Then we show you a headgear that very much looks like it's imitating kinky hair. And our argument is, if we can clearly see that this is hair, then what kind of hair would this be?
Mm-hmm.
And then that's one way of showing African influence in southern Mesopotamia. The other way is to look at the facial features of the sculptures. And of the actual Sumerian period, there are two kinds of facial features that occur in the sculptures. One is a very eagle faced, big curved nose kind of thing, one that people would say is definitely Caucasian. And the other one is a more African looking face. Now, the African looking face, you can do comparisons with, say, ancient Egyptians or ancient Kushites. And if you put the two of them side by side, nothing more need be said. The eagle faced one, however, I argue that those are Black people too. And what I do is I look at the investiture scene from Mari, ancient Mari, which is on the upper Euphrates. It's even further north in Mesopotamia. But when you see the complexions on um, on the individuals in the investiture scene, there's
Mm-hmm.
King Zimri of Mari receiving the symbols for office from the goddess Ishtar, who's standing on a lion. That's her thing. She stands on a lion.
Mm-hmm.
And given that she was goddess of war and rulership, it kind of makes sense. And you can see clearly from those complexions that these are Black people, even though the hair is more of the Dravidian kind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you take that and you compare with other sculptures from Mari, which are not done in color, you can see some of these eagle noses coming out. And when you then compare that eagle nose with an eagle nose with the color put in, you can then see that, okay, this is a dark colored person being compared with a person where there's no color given, but they've both got such similar profiles, you can only conclude that these are both dark colored individuals.
Hmm.
And that's how I deal with the eagle nose face.
And how do we deal with the blackheads? How should we interpret that,
Yeah,
the name to which they labeled themselves?
yeah. Blackheads I interpret the same way as the Isioji of the Igbo, because they've got the exact same phrase. Isi in Igbo means head, and Oji means black.
Hmm.
And they call Africa land of the blackheads.
Hmm.
And, the Sumerians called Mesopotamia land of the blackheads. Um, and I think it comes from the idea originally that where there were people of different races, um, most ethnic groups use the term human primarily to refer to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and only by extension to everybody else. And I think this is what was done with the term human by the Sumerians. The term blackhead meant human.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an ethnic group from South Arabia who are dark colored, and they've got this same term blackhead to mean a man. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not used in a racial sense, but the fact that a man, man homonym,
Mm-hmm.
man the species, uh, has two different words. Hor, meaning black, it's a Semitic thing, and Rish, meaning head, black head. In other words, to be human is to have a black head.
Mm-hmm.
That says something about the appearance of the group of people who came up with this term in the first place.
Yeah, because that same semantics, well, partially, in terms of they don't have a phrase blackheads in the ancient Egyptian, but the word tep, which means head, can also
Mm-hmm,
mean person.
mm-hmm.
And so that's a semantics that
Yeah.
one could look at more closely. And the hair becomes very important. For example, I discuss it. I'm having a debate and argument on the meaning of Kemet, one of the names for ancient Egypt. And I do it a little bit in here, but I think I do it more in this journal article that I just recently sent off to be reviewed for a major Egypt linguistic and Egyptology journal. Um,
Okay.
but it's these, as you stated, they didn't have our conceptualization of race like we do in the modern world, and but there are clues that make themselves known that are unintentional, that
Mm-hmm,
that the people give away certain phenotypic characteristics about themselves. So like, for example, when you get a band-aid, or at least back in the early days, if you and I were to go to the store to get a band-aid because we got a cut on our arm, what color is the band-aid more than likely going to be? It's going to be some
yeah.
kind of pale beige, and white, because the
Uh-huh.
people who created it, that's the first thing that comes to their mind. They're not trying to
Yeah.
be racist. It's just that
Yeah.
when they're creating the products for themselves, they're not thinking
Yeah.
of dark skin like it has to blend in for any
Uh-huh.
other ethnic group. It's just it's an unintentional. It tells you something about their characteristics. Same thing with, like,
Mm-hmm,
young girls or women who do ballet, and they have those tight colors that are in the same white and beige type colors to match their skin
mm-hmm.
color. But of course, it looks
Uh-huh.
crazy on a dark skin,
Yeah.
black, ballerina. But in that same kind of analogous, context, when you look at the hieroglyph for hair, the Gardner sign D3. It is of hair that twist
Yeah.
in these rich, what I'm saying, curls. It's not a straight,
Yes.
just
Hmm.
fall down like
Hmm.
the very curly hair of it. And it is the symbol, is the determinative or the classifier for skin complexion, and is used as a determinative in the word Kim, meaning black. So we know that the color of the hair itself is black because that's
Hmm.
the primary visual hieroglyph that they're using to represent blackness or very dark in color. And then
Hmm.
it's also the same glyph used for skin color, like the word, the consonant correspondences
That's
for that
interesting. I
word.
didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's a word for skin complexion, skin color. So if you have a glyph that means dark or black, and it's also the same word and is used also as a determinative for words for skin color, they're telling you that the overall skin color was of dark hue,
Yeah.
from a rich dark brown to black. And so it's
Hmm.
unintentional, you
Yeah.
know but if you pay attention to the culture and what the actual hieroglyphs mean, they tell you, you know who they are, and it would coincide with what you see on the actual walls and paintings and things where they're painting themselves of this dark brownish and reddish, saying colors in throughout the artistic work. So it's just those little clues that let us know that, you know that additional evidence, with everything else, makes the case, stronger, for these black relations. So with that being said, so how do you see the, well, what happened? So how did, was in your opinion at least, was it a situation where these quote unquote black African people, ended up migrating and finding themselves surrounded by non-black people, and they, integrated over time? Or was it a situation where you think that it was primarily populated by black people, and then more light-skinned people came later and overwhelmed into where the kind of colors that we see in that area today persist? So how do you see um, that happening?
I think when the Sumerians got there, they found other types of black people there. People
Mm,
like the indigenous Australians, say, or
mm,
like the black people of India, the ones who are actually black.
mm,
Um, Over time, I think by the time we get to the dynastic period in Mesopotamia, say around about 2500 BC, you start to get um, lighter skinned people from the north coming.
mm,
And my guess is they came by way of Syria and the Euphrates,
mm,
coming downstream, and from places like Armenia as well. So they may have come both through the Euphrates and the Tigris. And yeah, I'd say the areas north of Syria and the areas around Armenia. And that's how they trickle down and they accumulate first in northern Mesopotamia. But while that's where their main centers are, they also trickle down south.
mm,
And at first, it's independent of ethnicity. That means that all the people who were in southern Mesopotamia, whether they were Semitic or Sumerian, were
mhm,
dark skinned. But after a while, the groups that get taken over first
mhm,
are the groups that then become the vehicles of the racial change in the area. And I think it was northern Semitic groups that changed first and then started coming down. And then that led to, that helped expedite the racial change process in southern Mesopotamia.
Yeah, because that's going to be a big thing to kind of articulate and clarify, like, what was the history of that. And I think that is still kind of unfolding, as we
Yeah,
speak, to get a more clear picture. You mentioned that volume one, the linguistic work, that you didn't even put all of what you had in the text. So
yeah.
is what you didn't put in there, are you making a second edition of volume one, or is all of that going to be included in volume three?
That's the basis for volume three.
Okay. And so you mentioned that, life gets in the way. I wish we had like grants for independent scholars so that, we can take some time to just sit and make sure that all the bills are paid, so that all we could
Yeah.
do is focus on and hash out these works. And when I become a millionaire, I'm definitely going to set up something like that, because independent scholars need those grants, just like those who are associated with a university. But
And I, for one, would welcome that.
um, so so saying that to say that, this is still, volume three is still a work in progress, and there's not necessarily any date, proposed date, that you would be done and possibly release it.
I would say give me 2 years.
Okay, indeed, indeed.
I-
Well,
If 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 2 years is approaching and you haven't heard anything, then you have my permission to chase me up on it.
no doubt. Yeah, if you understand like how much work goes into writing books and to put together well thought out arguments, for the public. And so, like, I remember I was talking to Dr. Christopher Ehret,
Ah,
the historian and linguist, and I was asking him a question about the word Allah. And so I'm in a debate with Dr. Wesley Muhammad here in the United States on
okay.
whether the god Ra was an import into Egypt by Semites, and that they
Mhm.
changed Allah into Ra. So that was our
Okay.
debate. So um, I wrote a text in 2013, which I need to update drastically. But after that, I contacted Dr. Eric, and I asked him about Allah, and if it was um, if there was an Afroasiatic reflex, or
Mhm.
correspondence for that term.
Mhm.
Because I have his 1995 work where he attempts to justify the existence of Afroasiatic. And
Okay.
but one of the things I notice in there is that I mean, of course, you're primarily dealing with um, basic vocabulary, but he didn't have the word Allah. And so my question to him was, based on my experience in other world languages, that the simple word for spirit or God in any language is a common everyday word that is just, kind of elevated to represent some concept. So, like when you say spirit, it comes from a word simply meaning breath or air or something like that. So, I wanted to know what was the common everyday word for Allah, and
Mhm.
had he done any work. And so he gave me his answer, and he said that he was working on an update to that book, and that it'll
Mhm.
probably be done in another 3.5 years. From the time that we were talking about, like he already projected, like, yeah, it'll probably be done 3.5 years from now. And so,
Mhm.
just the thing, and this is a person who he gets paid just to do this type of
Yeah.
work. He's at the
Yeah.
university. They give them time to do research. And
Mhm.
so he was like, yeah, in another 3.5, basically 4 years, I should have something,
Mhm.
dealing with this question. And so your reply kind of reminded me of that correspondence that he and I had. Um, yeah,
I get it.
uh,
But to add to this thing, I have nothing to say on Ra itself, but the
mm-hmm,
concept about the spirit, you see, you may get to a stage where you have a reconstruction for the word God. I
mm-hmm,
can't say it as far back as Afro-Asiatic because I've never dealt with that particular group. But for Proto-Bantu, there's a term, uh, jambe, which
mm-hmm,
others reconstruct as nyambe. And the reason for the discrepancy would be to do with the prefixes in Proto-Bantu. One's been given a prefix, the other one is just the root that's been reconstructed. And there's also the question of should you reconstruct some of these things in certain cases with the prefix because they were essentially indivisible. In
mm-hmm.
some cases, there may be an argument for that. Now, to then break Nyambe down into a further etymology or to analyze it, to break it down into its constituent parts, that may be difficult unless if it's a case where there's some Proto-Bantu reconstructions that you can reconstruct not just the word, but you can actually reconstruct the etymology because the etymologies were still in use at the time that you're going back to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going back to a time where that etymology had been lost, then
Yeah.
you're going to have a problem in terms of finding out what was this everyday word that was then elevated to represent spirit or to represent God. You may struggle with with that in some cases.
Yeah, but that's why it's important to go beyond the Bantu, and you have to deal with this on a family basis. Now, again, I don't deal with Niger Congo because for me, the construct has not been proven. Uh, but like in the case of the word, Kodi, Proto Bantu Kodi, and Kol, or Kod, words for power, so to speak,
Yeah.
and then with the I
Yeah.
suffix, it becomes the word for God. Now we can do and what I've done is to do a series of two consonant paradigm comparisons with KD, KL in terms of like Chiluba and Kikongo with ancient Egyptian. And then you come to find that, it has two reflexes in ancient Egyptian. So one as the word necher and one as the
Mhm.
word, horde or heru, which are both, even the symbols both represent the word necher. So you have two different realizations of, um, and this is something that I'm bringing forth as well, is that Egyptian really kind of captures various dialects and or two or more languages, because some of the because you have internal correspondences as well that you cannot explain as a result of just a natural evolution on one single path and them both existing at the same time, in like old and middle Egyptian. Um,
Mhm.
and so you can tell, like, even with the word Aten, like in Akhenaten, like that is a cognate for the word Ra. And because Ra is really three consonants. It's R, well, let me do the transliteration. It's lowercase r, lowercase a dot w. And so it's really like, Rahehwe or Hahawa or something to this nature. But
Okay.
and so Ray is like, just kind of this Coptic variant, you know, years down the line after much sound change and things of that nature.
Mhm.
But in Middle Egyptian, it's a three consonant word. The W being a masculine agent suffix. But when you do a lot of the internal analysis, you can see that it's just the same words written differently, which lets us know that it was a multilingual society, and that it makes it kind of hard to determine what is actual Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom basic vocabulary, because you have three or four different variations of words, not variations, but totally different words for the same concept, which is a clue that other language speakers are present, in
Okay.
that
I
territory.
see.
Yeah, because
I see what you mean.
we're not going to have three or four words for sun and three or four words for head in the language and three or four words for arm and things of that nature. Like that tells us that something else is
Mhm.
going on there. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
and so they could be related languages that have converged in an area, and there could have been a convergence process at some time, but nonetheless, it's clear that, three or four languages, separate languages that went through separate sound evolutions ended up in that space. And their vocabulary was either, borrowed by, saying one group, or it's different groups who are writing and just using different words because it's reflective of their language, like like a kind of Spanglish, if you want to say, well, that's a term we use out here for Spanish and
Yeah.
English. Yeah,
English.
uh, so it's still unfolding, and it takes some very detailed and meticulous analysis, you know, um, and that's the kind of work like Jean Claude Mboli and Oscar Profuma, Omen Digi, people like myself are actively engaged in. Um, but yeah, so we're coming to a close now, and so I just wanted to kind of ask, if you had any, final words, uh, and where, people can kind of see, more of your, or where can they purchase your works? And we've already asked the question in terms of when the book is coming out. So he's given us 2 years. So y'all keep this in mind. So if by what is it, 2023, we don't see volume 3, we need to all put some pressure, on our good brother to release that text. But yeah, so if you have any last words, and a matter of fact, I'll do this. If y'all have any questions, for our guest, I'll probably do 2, at most 3 questions if anybody has questions, and then we'll close out these last 7 minutes. So it's going to be a little time delay. So if you have any parting words.
Yeah. I'll start with where the book's available before any
Yeah.
parting words. The book's available on Amazon.com
Mhm.
or Amazon.co.uk if you're in Britain. That's where Black Sumer is available, and other pomegranate titles are also available from Amazon. There's 3 of us authors as the pomegranate outfit. And basically, for me, what the Black Sumer message is, this is who we were back then.
Hmm.
This is who we can be again.
Mm.
But we need to go through a hell of a lot of self improvement first
Mm.
and group improvement before we can get to that level. Because the heights from where we've fallen, I think, if you read Chancellor Williams, I suppose different people remember different things. The thing that resonated for me when I read Chancellor Williams, there's a line in it where he says, if you want to see the heights from which the black race has fallen, you need go no further than the ruins of, he says no, but we would say Thebes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever been to Thebes
Yeah.
and you're stood there,
Mm-hmm.
in the temple complex, and you look around and you say, and where are we now? You
Mm-hmm.
can clearly see exactly what he was talking about. And when I look at the Sumerians and what they did, particularly in things like the astronomy, and where it seems like by using the sky, and this is in volume one, it's in the later chapters of volume one, they seem
Mm-hmm.
to have used the sky as a map for the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of saying, I'm going from London to Los Angeles, they
Mm-hmm.
might say, I'm going from this point in Ursa Major to this point in Ursa Minor, and it would represent points on Earth. And the only way you could do that is if you've mapped the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
That's who we were. Look where we are today.
Indeed.
And it really is a look in the mirror moment, to use Fari Sapir's words, to say, what do I need to do to get myself from where I am now
Mm-hmm.
back to where I was then and beyond?
Mm-hmm.
Because the student teacher relationship should always be about training the student to surpass you. That is the only way in which progress is possible. So if we want to progress, not only do we need to get back there, we need to surpass that. And only
Indeed.
then will we be able to get out of the kind of manacled, shackled situation that we're in.
Hmm. Indeed. And you know, you kind of lead me into um, our next guest. So we have Brother Robin Walker next week on the 14th. As a matter of fact, he does extensive work on African history in general, but he has some other works dealing with science in African people. And part of this conversation is and not only in terms of our humanistic and cultural strengthening, but our need to uh, get back into the strong sciences and to
Mhm.
know how to build civilizations and in this modern era. And so with that said, you know, part of that process, if we're not at the top now and there are other groups who have technologies, is to obtain those technologies and to learn how to reverse engineer those things and rebuild them so that we have a basis for our own creation of industries for which we can build an economy around. And so
Mhm.
we have coming on this coming Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here in the United States, a professor at Morgan State University who's an engineer and computer scientist, Dr. Kevin T. Cornege. I'll get the proper pronunciation on Wednesday, but or Carnegie, if we want to say that. Um, we're going to be talking about reverse engineering, and he has a whole institute at Morgan State University, and that's their whole focus. Their whole focus is reverse engineering products and things so that people know how to build them from the ground up. and it is from there that we can build. This is what China did. This is what Japan did, and they created their own industries. And now, China nor Japan created motor vehicles, but now their motor vehicles are sold all around the world and are top notch. And so, these are the necessary steps that we need to take in order to realize that goal in which our good brother Hermstein um, so neatly articulated just moments prior. And so, for those of you who are subscribers or just viewers of this program, I highly encourage everyone to listen into this live, 8 p.m. Eastern Time this Wednesday, July the 8th. On this channel. So Dr. Cornegay will be here, and I think he'll be doing a whole presentation for us. And so some good jewels from him. So let me take that off now, and I'll go back into, I saw a question earlier. This comes from Emmanuel Adama. Could you ask Mr. Hermstein to comment on the frieze of the royal guards of Darius the First? If you are familiar with that, I assume that's an artifact in Sumeria.
Yeah, I believe it's in one of my books. I think it's in volume 2. Anyway, the frieze of Darius the First, it shows guards, and there were essentially black Persians and white Persians, and it shows black Persian guards, and the black Persians were from what you might call an ethnic substrate within the Persian population known as the Elamites. The Elamites were non-Persians, but because they were the people who were there first, it was essentially Elamite civilization in Indo-European clothes. So they needed the Elamites to get all the information and things like a lot of the accountants in the Persian Empire were Elamites. So the black guards for Darius were essentially Elamites, Persianized Elamites, so to speak.
Good question, Brother Emmanuel. And let me go. This says, this is from Mary Hotep. I have a question relating to Petra. In Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, Drusilla Dungy Houston states that the builders of Petra were the Anu old race of ancient Egypt. I guess your question kind of cut off, and I don't see a part 2. Oh, here we go. Do we have any evidence that the builders of Petra were African, if you're familiar with that?
Yeah, Petra, there's a particular building in Petra where there is a face on that building, and the face is very African in the way it looks. I mean, even when you look at African faces, some of them are more obviously African, and some less so. This is of living Africans. This is unmistakably African, if I can put it that way. Unmistakably African, unambiguously so. And it's on that building in Petra. Rashidi shows a picture of it in one of his books. Now, we have to be careful about terms like African, because I would say these guys were Semitic. But I would call them Asiatic black people, because they'd been in Asia for a long time by that time. They're of African origin, but this is like maybe going back 8,000-9,000 years, maybe more. And yeah, that would be my answer to that one.
All right. And this will be the last question. Um, this is from Chuck Morgan. Would you suggest, I guess, a reinterpretation of Sajiji Ga as having originally meant native persons? And I guess this is the word for blackheads, instead of its literal meaning of the black-headed.
You see, right, well, let's break it down. Which would be you, a G with a little tilde over it so that it represents a nga, as in singer. It represents that sound. Means people in Sumerian. Sang means head. Ngi means black. Now, if you say it means native person, it's a bit like the same as saying it means human being. Sure, it can mean human being. It can mean native person. But the question then becomes, how does that etymology end up equaling native person? Why does it have these particular constituent parts? And the only reason why you would have the term black head equaling native person is because the people had black heads.
Mm-hmm.
The only way it would mean human being is because the group that originally came up with this were a people with black heads, and therefore they came up with that to mean human, in opposition to the out groups, the people outside their group, the foreigners, who they distinguish themselves from. Even today in Bantu languages, Bantu refers to the ethnic group of the person primarily, and then secondarily to Africans, and then third to the rest of the human race. So in Shona, for instance, people will refer to Lanu, which is the Shona term for Bantu, Lanu, and white people, for instance. They'll say that, or Lanu and some other race of people. So it primarily refers to themselves, black people in general, and then to the human race, number 3. So that term, even if it means native person, it doesn't make any difference in terms of what it actually means in its origins and what it represents, what it implies.
Well, I hope you got that, Brother Chuck Morgan. And that will be the last question. And so hopefully we can, have him on again in the future, if he has any updates for us. And, if we have to put the pressure on him to release, volume 3. And so I just want to thank you, for coming on and sharing with us your journey and the results of your hard work going back to the mid 90s. And so we'll have at least one of your colleagues coming back or coming here next week again. Robin Walker will be here on the 14th of July. That's going to be 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. London time. So thank you again. I look forward to your works and in future dialogues. And for those again who are not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. We want to make this the #1 premier channel for getting such information out there, and we can only do that with your support. And so help the algorithm, when people are doing these searches, to come to this channel, because we have a lot of good information, a lot of good scholars, and there's only more scholars, coming in the near future. So, and as soon as this COVID-19, kind of passes, we'll be doing some other video type stuff and some little mini documentaries, kind of, stylizing this information for public consumption, in very unique ways. So y'all donations and likes and sharing of the videos help in, us to realize that goal much sooner and greatly. So thank you all for listening. Remember that we have on Wednesday Professor Kevin T. Carnegie, who's going to be talking about reverse engineering, and that's going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And look forward to seeing you all there. So with that, I'm going to say good day. Y'all be safe. And I will talk to y'all later. Peace.